This is Robert Shedd, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps February 2nd, 1942 through September 27th, 1945. This is March 21st, 2003 in Voorheesville, New York. The interviewers are Kenneth and June Hunter. Can you tell us what your full name is and when and where you were born?
My name is Robert Clarence Shedd. I was born in West Rutland, Vermont,
And,
August 29th, 1921.
and what was your pre-war education and occupation?
I was a high school graduate, and I worked on the farm until we moved to Connecticut, and I worked at Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Company as a machine operator.
Now, what caused you to enter the service and what was it like?
Well, we had the old familiar reading the funnies on Sunday morning when Pearl Harbor happened that so many people did, and then there was the Wake Island incident, and my two brothers and I liked what we heard about the Marines and decided the three of us would join, which we did. And then we went to recruit training at Parris Island in South Carolina, and for advanced training at what was then called New River in North Carolina. Today it's called Camp Lejeune. From there we went overseas through the Panama Canal to New Zealand for another year of advanced training. We were there for about 2 weeks when our general heard that we were needed at Guadalcanal and there would be no more training. The ships came in commercially loaded, which was not good for combat, so they had to be unloaded and reloaded. And the New Zealand stevedores wouldn't work in the rain, they wouldn't work Sunday, so the Marines took over the loading of the ships, and with the short time that we had, we were ready to go. With part of the division was coming in from the States, and we met en route to Guadalcanal, had a fiasco of a dress rehearsal in the Fiji Islands, and then went through a storm to Guadalcanal and landed August 7th, and out of the book landing. Everything went just the way it was supposed to.
What was the mood of the country like, and why did you choose the Marine Corps?
Well, we thought the Marines sounded like a real tough outfit, and we wanted to be in that outfit.
Now, you said you joined with your two brothers. Were all three of you in the same outfit?
We were all in the same platoon.
All through the Pacific campaigns?
No. In October of 1942, my two brothers were out on a work party building a new regimental command post, and they had no foxholes, no protection, and the Japanese came over with their bombers, and our fighters got after them, and they jettisoned their bombs out over the jungle right into our company work party. 5 members were killed, and both of my brothers were wounded. And Paul was sent then to New Zealand to the hospital, and Donald was bandaged up and sent back to duty. I was just out of the hospital with malaria, so I was on light duty and was excused from going on the working party.
Now, what was it like being transferred over to Australia, New Zealand area. I'm sure it wasn't the Queen Mary, what we're accustomed to hearing about today, luxurious ships.
Well, you're wrong. It was a luxurious ship. It was the Manhattan, I believe it was called. And it still had the big paintings up in the dining room, and the staterooms for 2 people. We had 12 men in them. I was on mess duty when we started down through the Caribbean, and when my mess duty was over, I went back to my squad, and so there were 13 people with 12 beds. And we went through a horrible storm, and a great many people were sick from it. I wasn't. I didn't get seasick.
When you landed over in our allied countries, how were you treated? Did you have much contact with the people there and men from the other forces?
Not too much from the men, because the New Zealanders, the Anzac forces, were pretty much in North Africa, along with the Australian forces. But the people were very cordial, invited us to their homes, the short time that we had for any shore leave.
And do you remember when you went to their homes, what sort of meals they served, or did you do entertainment or anything?
Like I said, we didn't have too much time to do that, but their meals, of course, we got a little mixed up with their way of speaking. They would invite us for tea, so we'd make sure we had a good meal first, and come to find out tea is their what we would call dinner or supper. And I didn't happen to fall in that, but some of the men did.
Now, I believe you attained the rank of corporal, and you were in a variety of units, assignments there. Could you tell us something about that?
Yes, I went through almost 4 years in the Marine Corps, and I never got in trouble, and yet all I made was corporal. I passed the test for sergeant once, but I was for some time assistant squad leader, and it just happened a couple of times that when we were scheduled to go out on overnight patrols outside of our lines, that the sergeant, who was a squad leader, didn't feel well. So I ended up taking the squad out, and we had some good times on those patrols. One time we did see a poor old Japanese, and I wanted to capture him, and one of the fellows went and shot him. And I always felt bad about that. But one time we came to a native village where they had decided it was safe to move back in, and they were celebrating, and they had baked some taro root. So they offered us some. It was delicious. They baked it in the open fire. Another time, some of the native men went with us and wanted to carry our equipment. Well, that was all right until they wanted to carry our rifles, and we said, no, we'll do that. And one of them brought us home one time a different way on one of their canoes upstream, and he pulled a whole bunch of us upstream in that native canoe. They were very strong, physically strong people.
Now, in your skills and ratings, I'm sure that you had to become familiar with rifles, small arms, the Browning automatic rifle, and I believe you said you acted as assistant squad leader and a small arms mechanic. Could you tell us something about what the weaponry was like in this training and skills that you acquired?
Well, when we first went overseas, we had the bolt action Springfield rifle, which was left over from World War One, and the banana wars of the 19 teens. Then after Guadalcanal, we were all issued the M1 rifle, which was semi-automatic, and you could just fire as fast as you could pull the trigger. That gave us a lot more firepower than the Japanese had. They always, all the way through the war, had the bolt action rifle. At one time I was a BAR man. I carried a Browning automatic rifle. That was quite a heavy rifle, and I think with the ammunition and the rifle it was around 21 pounds. And then later on I was put in company headquarters, and while I was in the company headquarters I became the company armorer, and any of the men that had problems with their weapons would bring them to me, and I was authorized to strip them down beyond the field stripping that they could do, and take them apart and possibly put new parts in them. It went a little bit overboard. I was recently reading one of my letters that I sent home, and they used to bring me all kinds of things like watches and watch straps to fix, and then they found out I knew how to glue the metal part of the weapon, so they used to bring me pistols, and I would take all the springs and wooden parts away and blew them over a flame of diesel fuel, and I was just a handyman for the whole company.
Now, after that training and getting familiarized with the weapons and practicing things and doing all these other sort of odd jobs, then came the serious time to go out and use the skills that you learned. Tell us about the theater campaigns you were in.
Well, first I was in the Guadalcanal campaign. That lasted from when we landed at August 7th, 1942. We were there until December 9th, 42. And that was one of the turning points of the Pacific War. The Japanese had been advancing, and nobody seemed to be able to stop them until they came to Guadalcanal, and they had overextended, and they lost upwards of 30,000 men in the Guadalcanal campaign. Many of them were lost in the ships on their way to the island. Many that were on the island died of starvation. Because the second day we were there, we captured all their food, and they had no way to get more food. When they brought new troops, they never brought food enough for them, and we thought we had it bad, but they had it much worse than we did as far as physical conditions were concerned. I never was wounded seriously on Guadalcanal. I did have malaria 9 times, with temperatures as high as 105, but it never did any serious damage except the high temperature damaged my teeth. So then after 9 months in Australia, where we had a great time and gained a lot of weight and got ourselves back in condition, we sailed up through the Great Barrier Reef, which was quite an experience, and made a couple of stops in northern Australia onto New Guinea, where we did advanced training and were staged from there to the island of New Britain. MacArthur wanted that out of his way to clear his flank so he could go farther north in New Guinea. In that particular campaign, we were under MacArthur's orders, and he called us his Marines. And if you remember later, he had his Marines in Korea. He called them up then, and they went in very short order. But that's getting aside from my story. On New Britain, I was wounded the second day ashore in a skirmish with the Japanese. We were circling south to come up on the airport and ran into a group of them. I don't know for sure how many. And we lost some 5 men, and quite a group of us were wounded. And from there we walked back through swamps and jungle until we came to a road where a jeep going by picked us up and took us to the hospital. I'm still in touch with 2 of the men that walked out with us. One of them was seriously injured in his right arm, but he became a dentist. So then I had about 6 weeks in New Guinea to recuperate and have a good time with some of the pretty nurses there. But I kept hearing stories about what our boys were doing, because every once in a while somebody would get wounded and come to that hospital, and we'd hear about what the company was up to. And finally I asked the doctor if I couldn't be discharged and go back, and he let me go. He thought it was early, but he let me go. So I did pay for it. I got an infection in my back, but nothing serious. And then we did a lot of patrolling and got to see Talisea in the northern part of New Britain. A beautiful, beautiful country. Even though it rained a lot. And then while we were there, we went on patrol several times. Overnight we'd go south on the peninsula and spend the night in a native village someplace. There were very few of the natives around. They had gone to safer places. And one night in the rain we slept under one of the native huts, and some kind of little insects in the hut fell down on us and stung us, and wherever they stung us we had a little red spot. Well, shortly after that we were sent back to the other end of the island, and where there was no more hostilities, and we were put on the beach and quarantined because the doctors thought we had some kind of a communicable disease. So we went swimming, we sunbathed, and we slept, and we read, and we didn't have any work parties, we didn't have patrols, and we just enjoyed life for a couple of weeks of quarantine. Then from there we went to the beautiful island of Pavuvu. It was a terrible place to send men to recuperate. Other people went to Hawaii, back to New Zealand. The 1st Marine Division went to Pavuvu. There were mud, land crabs, rats, but we fixed it up, and eventually we even had showers, and got ourselves back in shape, and got on the LSTs, and we sailed north to the Palau Islands. And there we made a landing against very stiff opposition with machine guns and mortars, artillery, tanks, the whole bit, but we persevered, and we crossed the airport the next day. And as we crossed the airport, they opened up with everything that they had from the hills. They could look right down on us. And we started across with around 200 men. We got across, we had 90 left. And we had one officer left. And so he gave me the job of taking a message back across that airport to the beach. When I got back to the beach, I delivered my message and was glad to get out of there because the Japanese were shelling the beach at that point. Got almost back to the company, and I saw one of our men that had been wounded and couldn't get himself up on his feet. So back across the airport with him. Then after I got him to the corpsman where he could be taken care of, I crossed that airport once more. And they never touched me. And Pelago was probably the worst of the 3 campaigns that I was in. The heat was terrific. It was sometimes as much as 115 degrees. Many of our men had heat exhaustion. There was not much water. Some of the water they sent to us was in cans that had gasoline in, and that didn't sit too well. But I went through that campaign without getting wounded at all, and it was supposed to last 2 or 3 days. We were there 6 weeks. It was very well defended with caves. So then after 3 campaigns, I finally came home. I sailed back across the Pacific. When we went by Hawaii, the ship's radio was picking up the radio from the shore. And I remember the announcer said, "And now we bring you Occidental's own Ma Perkins." And it put a lump in my throat big enough to choke a horse, but I was coming home. And we got into San Francisco and took the train to San Diego recruit depot. Got there just in time for the permanent personnel to go home for 2 weeks for Christmas and New Year's, and we were to stay on base. Couldn't leave the base. But eventually they came back and we were sent east, and I had a 30-day delay en route on my way back to recruit depot, Paris Island, South Carolina, where I became a rifle coach. And stayed there until in August. I've forgotten the exact date. I was in the hospital with malaria. And I was well enough at that point to go to the movies, and while I was in the movies we heard about the Japanese surrender. And about a month later I was discharged and I went home.
Now, life back in the campaigns, there must have been periods when there was lulls and you could get together. Was there any? Was mail delivered to you? How was frequency of mail delivery? Were you able to get news of things going on in other places in the world back home?
Yes, in the campaigns we did get letters. I think it was, we were overseas a month or more before we got, perhaps 6 weeks before we got any mail delivered at Guadalcanal. But we did occasionally get it, and it would come in groups. And when we weren't actually in the campaign, we did get news, and I used to keep maps with little flags in what the Russians were doing and what the Germans were doing, and just following around the whole world.
Now, while you were out there, we've heard a lot about USO shows and entertainers coming out there. Were you ever in a location where you had such an opportunity to see some of these people from the entertainment world?
Yes, a few times. Well, when we were in Australia, for instance, no, it was when we were in New Guinea. The Australian men used to come up, and they would play women's parts, and if you didn't know for sure that they were men, you could be fooled by it. They played the parts very well. But I remember particularly one time when we were at Pavuvu, Bob Hope and his show were at a neighboring island. This Pavuvu and Bonica, where Bob Hope was, are about 60 miles north of Guadalcanal. It's in a group called the Russell Islands. Bob was playing at Bonica, and none of us were allowed, officers included, to go to Bonica. They had too many nice things there, Red Cross girls, and they had nurses, and you could get candy and ice cream and all those nice things. And as it's often been said, nothing was ever too bad for the 1st Marine Division. So somehow somebody did get word to Bob Hope that we would like him to come to Pavuvu. And he thought that would be good. So he was flown from Bonica over to Pavuvu, he and his whole troop, Jerry Colonna, and I don't remember the other girls. And they landed on the roadway in the Piper Cubs and put on their show. And Bob had said later it was one of the greatest shows he put on because of the participation from almost the complete 1st Marine Division was in the field to hear him. And we did enjoy that. When we were in New Guinea, we had a natural amphitheater where we used to go to the movies at night. And one time Gary Cooper and Una Merkel and some other actors from Hollywood were there and put on a show for us. But those are the only 2 times I seem to remember USO shows. We had movies quite often, except when we were at the front.
Now, we hear a lot about the military people were not paid much back in those days. Can you remember what your pay was then, and how often did you get paid, or did it accumulate and until you got back to the States?
Uh, when I first went in, a private got $21 a month. Um, but out of that, you had to pay for your 782 gear, so the first 6 weeks I was in, I earned $14. Uh, and I suppose before we went overseas there was a regular payday. I don't just remember what that was. When I was overseas, I had no need for money generally, and I would just let it ride and build up. And occasionally I would draw it out and send it home.
Now, what kind of food did you have out in the field? I'm sure you didn't have steak, mashed potatoes. That we heard a lot about things like C rations, K rations. Could you tell us about that?
When we landed at Guadalcanal, we had C rations, and one can would have beans in it, another would perhaps have corned beef hash. There was a stew, those three. And together with that, you got another can which had crackers and powder for lemonade, and a type of instant coffee, which never seemed to work because it had been in the can so long. But they would fill you up. Then at noontime we had what was called a D ration, which was what these days we'd call it a power bar. It was a chocolate bar and had lots of vitamins and food value of one type or another in it. But of course that didn't last too long in Guadalcanal, and we then had to eat the food that we captured from the Japanese, and a lot of it was barley, and it came in straw bags, so it had weevils in it, but we used to say it's a little extra protein, and lots of rice. And occasionally we get beef with seaweed and soy sauce. And I remember one time I got a hold of a can of crab meat. I ate so much of it, I didn't want crab meat for years and years afterwards. And occasionally salmon. But then eventually our own supplies started to come in on Guadalcanal, and we ate better then. And when they started to cook started to make pancakes, they never could make enough to suit us. And then when we went to New Britain, they didn't have the C rations anymore. They went up to the K rations, which were quite a lot more palatable. And more variety. There would be bacon and different kinds of pork and egg and things in the cans. They were quite good. Now they have the MREs,
Meals ready to eat.
ready to eat, right.
Now, for personal grooming out there, how often did you have the luxury of shaving or being able to bathe?
Bathing was pretty much a matter of finding a nice beach or a river in action. Of course, we never had showers. I do remember on the island of Pelido, it was 5 days before I took my shoes and socks off. And my feet were just brown and the socks came apart. They'd been wet and dry, and they were a mess. I had trouble with my feet all during the war. and they treated me for all kinds of, well, we call it spick itch and athlete's foot. After I got home and started to wear cotton socks, I found out I was allergic to wool. And that's what it was, and why they couldn't cure it. It was just an allergy.
Now, you had very limited medical assistance in the field. You had corpsmen assigned to the units. What was it like being treated by them? Were they up on the lines with you? How was that handled?
The Marines always thought the corpsmen were the bravest of the brave. They would expose themselves to fire to come up and take care of a wounded Marine. And many of them died doing it. And they were very competent. I've heard of them doing appendectomies. I remember one person was wounded in the throat. The corpsman cut a little slot into his windpipe, put the rubber part from a fountain pen in there, and made a stoma. And they could do things right off the cuff. But they were just great, and so brave.
Now, I assume that through all these campaigns you must have earned some decorations, medals, or commendations. Can you tell us what kind of awards you received?
Well, the Purple Heart is the only personal one, and that was because I was wounded on the island of New Britain. Our unit was awarded 2 presidential unit citations, and I have on the Asiatic Pacific ribbon a silver star in lieu of 5 bronze stars for campaigns.
Well, in the service, you must have made quite a few friendships, and of course you probably had occasions when there's a person or maybe a couple of persons you wish they had never been born. Can you tell us something about that? There were some that may have been inspiring and some who were detested.
As far as the detesting part, there's only one man that might possibly come under that. Somehow or other, somebody had brought a dog aboard ship on our way to one of the campaigns, and this man threw the dog overboard, and the men just didn't like that. But to be in action with another man, and then to know him afterwards, he is so close. People that haven't been there just can't understand, I guess, how close you can come to a man that you've risked your life with.
Now, you must have had an unusual, maybe a funny incident or an inspiring thing that has stuck with you in your experiences in the service. Anything come to mind? You were talking earlier about the trip into no man's land. Anything else like that?
I don't seem to think of anything right now.
Now, are there any one person or group of persons that you remember best from your service, and why is that?
Well, I do meet occasionally with some of the men that were in service with me at the 1st Marine Division Association reunions. They have one in July or August every year. And I meet some of the men that I knew, and we just talk old times. And of course, there are fewer of us every year now. I lost 4 of those men last year. But it's just great to see any of them that I can remember. I suppose the 2 men that were wounded when I was are probably as close as any of them. But some of them I can remember that way back when we were in North Carolina, when I first met them.
Now, when you came back from overseas, what were your thoughts? What did it feel like when you came back and landed in the United States and knew that it was you were going to be here, the horrible experiences were behind you?
Oh my goodness, that was a great experience. Of course, like I said earlier, we were stranded on the West Coast for 2 weeks, but then I came home and saw my folks, and my mother saw me, and oh my goodness, she said, what have they done to my boy? She said my eyes kind of stared out of my face. I didn't realize it, but I spent a month then with my family before I went back. It was the only thing that came close to being a furlough that I had. Later on, I got 10 days to come home once, but other than that, while I was in, was 2 or 3 day weekends. I lost track of where I was. What was the...
Oh, you came back.
Oh,
what the
yes.
mood was like in the country then? What were your feelings?
Yeah, and then I went to Paris Island and I became a coach on the rifle range. And it was getting towards the end of the war, and of course at that time they were expecting to invade Japan. And some men that had been over as long as I had were all ready to go back again, and I was expecting that I would have to go back again. But then, as I said, the war ended while I was still at Paris Island, so I didn't have to go back, thank goodness.
Just reflecting back before you arrived in the States, and how did you find out about the end of the war in Europe?
Let's see, that was in May, wasn't it?
May of 1945.
Yes. So in May of 1945, I would have been on the island of Pavuvu, and not in action, so I suppose I really don't remember it, but we did get news one way or another, and I just actually don't remember that the war in Europe, when it ended.
I guess the feeling was a great sigh of relief when it was announced that the war was over in the Pacific.
Oh yes. Oh, that was so good. Of course, we didn't have the celebration that they had in Times Square, but we really felt good that all those awful times were over.
We were talking earlier, and you mentioned that there was a great impression on you when you were on Guadalcanal and had very few supplies, no Navy, no airplanes, very little ammunition except that what you had on you, and you're more or less left to your own. What was it like, and how did things improve?
Well, we thought it would be another Wake Island, that we would just be left there, and eventually the Japanese would probably be victorious over us. But night and day there would be Japanese bombers would come in, drop bombs. Sewing machine Charlie, we called one of them. He would just fly around overnight, and every once in a while he would drop a bomb someplace. He never did much damage, but keep us awake. And then somewhere around noon every day, flight of Japanese bombers would come over and drop their bombs, usually trying to hit the airport. So luckily we were out away from the airport and seldom had much damage in our area from the bombs. Then one day we happened to look down the coast and could see a couple of destroyers coming up. Well, we figured here's another shelling from the ships, until it got a little bit closer and we could see the American flag flying from the masthead. And boy, we felt good then, because we found out that the Americans hadn't forgotten us, that they were trying to help. And so these ships didn't immediately help us too much. We had to help unload bombs and aviation gasoline, which meant that eventually we might have some airplanes to help defend us, which we did. And those were great heroes to us, the airmen, because they could drive the Japanese planes away and shoot them down. Then the ships, supply ships, started coming in and bringing in food. And one interesting sidelight there was that we got a lot of the Japanese trucks that we captured in operation, and they would go down to the beach and load up with supplies and bring it up to the supply area, the dump. Except one truck, we had a fellow in our company who was a mechanic. He got a truck going, took the rotor out of the distributor cap, and took it back to the company, and motor transport people could never get that truck started. And so when the supplies would come in, he would go down with his truck, load up, stop at the company area and unload a few cases of peaches and some goodies that we probably wouldn't see otherwise, and then go on down to the food dump with the rest of it. So we had a few goodies from Billie Jean Schwaka.
Now, we heard a lot about propaganda during World War II out in the Pacific, especially from Tokyo Rose. Were there any occasions when your unit ever heard propaganda coming from Japan, and especially from her?
Oh yes. Towards the end, we were camped near the general's tent. We didn't have tents. We slept out in the open. But we would gather around his tent in the evening and listen to Tokyo Rose. And we used to get a big kick out of it, but somebody from our unit was letting Tokyo Rose know what was going on. Otherwise, how could she know? But we used to listen to her, but it was more, we took it as a joke in a way, but it was really serious that somebody was letting her know what was going on.
Now, when you got back to the States, I'm sure you were glad everything was all over there. Did you have any unusual experiences being out processed and then being able to return home and get back in the community and get a job? How were things then?
Well, of course, I still have a paper that says that my job will be there when I get back, if I'm able to do it, which it wasn't, because it was in the aircraft factory and they didn't need help. One thing that comes to mind is that when we left the West Coast to come home, we were on a train to a key city, which was supposed to be the one nearest our home. Well, of course, to get to Vermont, I had to go to New York and then take another train up. And New York, of course, was a key city. But for some reason, they picked Cincinnati, Ohio for my closest to home. So I had to pay my way from Cincinnati to New York to Vermont, which wasn't much then, but it was a lot of money to us.
They had at that time, I understand, a program from the government called the 5220 Club, where you could receive $20 a week for the 52 weeks, in order to help you get over the thing and back into work habit. Are you aware of that? Any recollections?
Yes, but I got home and I was home 3 days when I had landed a job and went to work. So I was an apprentice carpenter, and I worked for a little while there until the superintendent thought I was getting too much money, because I think I was getting 75 cents an hour from him and a few dollars a week from the government, and he thought that was too much money for me. We just didn't get along. So I became a carpenter anyhow.
Now, when you got back, did you find anything unusual here? How the climate was? Were the people glad to see you? Well, how were things at stores? Could you find goods? Were they becoming more readily available?
Of course, everybody was glad to see us and to have us home again. I don't remember any problem buying things at the store.
As I know during the wartime period, a lot of people back home here had to cut down on things. They used ration books and tokens to buy things, and gasoline was limited and so forth. And these things, it eased up at the end of the war over in Japan, and things became more available, and people were much happier then. And the mood changed to get away from the war mood and get back into a normal life.
Yes, of course, I didn't realize too much about the rationing. I do remember one time my folks always wanted to know what they could send. Well, actually, as far as food, we had food. But one time we thought we would like some salami. And I wrote home and asked my mother if she could send some, not realizing that they would have to give up a lot to do that. But she sent one. And a small salami. Of course, it had become covered with mold by the time we got it over in the islands, but we just took that away and enjoyed it. It just happened to come, as I remember, when we were at Pavuvu, where we didn't have the best of food. In fact, I remember one time we went on strike and wouldn't eat the food, and we got across the point across to the officers, and they got busy and did a better job, but they could only do what they could with what food they had. At one time on the island of Pavuvu, the people had left some cattle there, and so we opened up a slaughterhouse. But the New Zealanders heard about it and made us stop that because we were killing their cattle.
Now, I assume that you've kept up your association. You mentioned earlier that you write for the 1st Marine Division. Tell us about that and reunions that you have. How often are these things?
Every year, the 1st Marine Division has a reunion, and I was in A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and we have, a lot of us have tried to locate different ones so that we now have quite a large group, and at the reunion we have our own hospitality room and with a wet bar, and get in trouble with the hotels because we bring in our own drinks and so forth. But it's great to meet with those old buddies. They're starting to use canes and lose their hair, but they're still our buddies.
This has been an interview with Robert Clarence Shedd from Voorheesville, New York. On March 17th, 2003, your interviewers have been Ken and June Hunter.